The autumn wind cut through Millfield like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. It was October 1887, and the small frontier town seemed to shrink into itself as the sun disappeared behind the jagged mountains that surrounded the valley like sleeping giants. Sarah Mitchell sat hunched against the weathered brick wall of Henderson's General Store, her once blue dress now faded to the color of ash and torn at the hem. 3 days had passed since she'd arrived on the last stagecoach, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart heavy with loss. The consumption had taken her husband, Thomas, just 2 months after their wedding, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and a reputation that followed her like a shadow. The townspeople of Millfield had made their judgment quickly. Word travelled fast in small places, and somehow the story had gotten twisted in the telling. They whispered that she'd brought the sickness with her, that she was bad luck, that decent folk should keep their distance. Shop owners turned their backs when she approached, mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, and the preacher had even suggested she move on to the next town for everyone's sake. Sarah pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the bitter cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago, now settled into a hollow ache that matched the emptiness in her chest. She'd sold her wedding ring yesterday for a few coins, enough for a single meal, but even that was gone now. The main street of Millfield stretched before her like a river of mud and disappointment. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows, casting warm yellow rectangles onto the wooden sidewalks. Families gathered around dinner tables, their laughter and conversation drifting out into the night air like cruel reminders of everything she'd lost. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere, to have someone waiting for her to come home. From her spot against the cold brick, she could see the Lucky Strike saloon at the end of the street, its bat-wing doors swinging constantly as cowboys and drifters came and went. Earlier, she'd considered going in, thought maybe she could find work washing dishes or cleaning floors, but the look the bartender had given her through the grimy windows told her everything she needed to know. Even the saloon had standards, it seemed. A group of women emerged from the church across the street, their dark skirts rustling as they walked briskly toward their homes. Sarah recognized Mrs. Whitman among them, the banker's wife who'd been kind enough to explain why no respectable establishment would hire her kind. The women's voices carried on the wind, fragments of conversation about Sunday's service and whose turn it was to organize the church social. "Poor thing looks half dead," one of them murmured, and Sarah knew they were talking about her. "Well, maybe she should move along then," came the sharp reply. "This is a Christian town. We can't have that sort of element hanging around our children." Sarah's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground. She'd learned that looking directly at people only made them more uncomfortable, more likely to cause trouble. Better to make herself invisible, to disappear into the shadows, and hope they'd forget she existed. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness claimed the town. Sarah's breath came out in small white puffs, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. She knew she couldn't stay outside much longer. The nights were growing deadly cold, and she had nowhere to go. No money for a room, no friends to take her in, no family to turn to. The reality of her situation settled over her like a burial shroud. It was then that she heard the soft clopping of horse hooves on the packed dirt road. A lone rider approached slowly, his silhouette dark against the lamplight spilling from nearby windows. Sarah tensed, pulling her shawl up to hide more of her face. Late-night riders were often trouble, especially for women alone on the streets. The horse stopped directly in front of her, but Sarah didn't look up. She'd learned that avoiding eye contact was usually the safest course. The rider dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Still, Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the wooden planks of the sidewalk, counting the nail heads and hoping he would simply move on. But he didn't move on. Instead, she heard the jingle of spurs as he took a step closer, then stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sounds were the distant piano music from the saloon and the whisper of wind through the eaves of the buildings around them. Sarah could feel his presence like heat from a fire, could sense his eyes on her, though she dared not look up. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird desperate to escape its cage. What did he want? What would he demand of her? She'd heard stories about what happened to women alone on the frontier, stories that made her skin crawl and her hands shake. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the cold darkness. Still, he stood there, silent as a statue, while Sarah tried to make herself even smaller against the unforgiving brick wall. She could hear him breathing, slow and steady, could smell the scent of leather and horses and something else, something clean and warm that reminded her of better times. Finally, when the suspense became unbearable, Sarah dared to raise her eyes just enough to see his boots. They were well worn but well cared for, brown leather polished to a dull shine, despite the dust of the trail. Above them, she could see the edge of worn denim and the bottom of a long coat that swayed slightly in the breeze. And still, he waited. Sarah's heart continued its frantic rhythm as she slowly, carefully raised her gaze higher, past the brass belt buckle that caught the lamplight, past the faded blue shirt that spoke of long days under the open sky, until finally she found the courage to look into the face of the stranger who had stopped to stare at her in the middle of the night. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His face was angular and strong, marked by the kind of quiet dignity that came from facing life's hardships head-on. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath entirely. They were the color of deep water, blue-gray like the sky just before dawn, and they held none of the judgment or disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, there was something else there, something that made her chest tight and her throat close up with unexpected emotion, compassion, understanding, recognition. This was a man who knew what it meant to be alone. He didn't speak, didn't ask her name or demand explanations. He simply looked at her with those steady, gentle eyes, and Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. When was the last time someone had truly seen her? Not the rumors or the reputation, not the faded dress or the desperate circumstances, but her. The woman beneath the pain, the person worth acknowledging. The cowboy, for that's what he clearly was, from his practical clothes to the way he carried himself, shifted slightly, and Sarah tensed, ready to bolt if necessary. But instead of moving toward her, he reached up with slow, deliberate movements and began to untie the string at his throat. Sarah watched, transfixed, as he removed his coat. It was a long, dark thing, lined with what looked like sheepskin, the kind of garment that meant the difference between life and death during the brutal frontier winters. It was probably the most valuable thing he owned aside from his horse and gun, and he was taking it off. The wind caught the coat as he lifted it from his shoulders, and Sarah caught a glimpse of its thickness, its warmth, the care with which it had been maintained. This wasn't just clothing to him, it was survival, protection, a shield against the harsh realities of life on the trail, and he was giving it to her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as he took a step forward, then knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her level. Up close, she could see the kindness in his weathered features, the way his mouth was set in a gentle line rather than the hard slash of judgment she'd grown used to. His movements were careful, respectful, asking permission even though he never spoke a word. With infinite tenderness, he lifted the coat and settled it around her shoulders. The warmth hit her immediately, not just from the lingering heat of his body, but from the weight of the gesture itself. The coat smelled like leather and sage and wide-open spaces, like freedom and possibility and everything she'd lost. But it wasn't the coat that broke her. It was the look. As he adjusted the collar around her neck, making sure she was properly covered, his eyes met hers again. And in that moment, Sarah saw something that made her soul crack wide open. She saw recognition, not of who she was or what people said about her, but of the pain she carried, the loneliness that ate at her from the inside out. She saw understanding that ran deeper than words, compassion that asked nothing in return. Most of all, she saw a promise. You are not alone anymore. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks suddenly spilled over, hot tracks down her cold cheeks. She tried to speak, to thank him, to ask his name, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was too tight, her heart too full of an emotion she couldn't name. The cowboy reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't move, he gently brushed the tears from her face with the backs of his fingers. His hands were rough from hard work, but infinitely gentle, and the simple touch nearly undid her completely. "Shh," he whispered, the first sound he'd made since arriving. His voice was low and warm, like whiskey by a campfire, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "You're safe now." Sarah closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, just for a moment, allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, those words were true. The coat enveloped her like a cocoon, shutting out the cold wind and the cruel whispers of the town. For the first time in months, she felt protected. When she opened her eyes again, he was studying her face with that same patient intensity, as if he was memorizing every detail. There was no pity there, no condescension, just a quiet strength that made her feel like she could breathe again. "What's your name?" she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. A small smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first expression of anything other than concern she'd seen from him. "Jake," he said simply. "Jake Morrison." "Sarah," she replied, and something shifted in his eyes at the sound of her name, like he was filing it away somewhere safe. "Sarah," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like something precious, something worth protecting. Not the name of a woman to be shunned and whispered about, but the name of someone who mattered. Jake stood slowly, his knees creaking slightly from the cold and the years of hard living. He looked down at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him thinking, weighing something in his mind. "There's a boarding house about a mile outside town," he said finally. "Mrs. Patterson runs it. She's different from most folks around here. Good different. She might have a room, and she could use help with the cooking and cleaning." Hope fluttered in Sarah's chest like a caged bird testing its wings. "Why would you—" she started, but Jake held up a hand. "Everyone deserves a chance," he said simply, "and everyone deserves kindness, especially when the world's been cruel." He walked back to his horse, a steady chestnut mare with intelligent eyes, and swung himself into the saddle with practiced ease. From up there he looked down at Sarah, still wrapped in his coat, still trying to process what had just happened. "I'll be by Mrs. Patterson's tomorrow around noon," he said. "If you're there, I'll introduce you proper. If not—" He shrugged, but his eyes remained kind. "Well, the coat's yours either way." With that, he tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect that made her heart swell, and urged his horse into motion. Sarah watched him ride away until he disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone again, but somehow, miraculously, not lonely. She pulled his coat tighter around herself and breathed in the scent of safety and second chances. Tomorrow, she would walk to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Tomorrow, she would try to build something new from the ashes of her old life. But tonight, wrapped in the warmth of a stranger's kindness, she finally understood what it meant to be seen as worthy of love. Sarah woke before dawn, curled against the brick wall, with Jake's coat wrapped around her like armor against the world's cruelty. The first light of morning painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and for the first time in months she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The coat had kept her warm through the night, but more than that, it had given her something she'd almost forgotten existed, the knowledge that there were still good people in the world, people who saw suffering and chose to ease it rather than add to it. As the town began to stir around her, Sarah stood slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. She brushed the dust from her dress as best she could and ran her fingers through her tangled hair, trying to make herself presentable. If she was going to meet Mrs. Patterson, she wanted to make a good impression. The walk to the boarding house took her through parts of the countryside she hadn't seen before, past fields that lay fallow for the winter and groves of cottonwood trees whose leaves had turned brilliant gold. The morning air was crisp and clean, free from the dust and noise of town, and Sarah found herself breathing deeper than she had in weeks. The boarding house, when she finally found it, was a two-story wooden structure painted white with green shutters. A wraparound porch stretched across the front, decorated with hanging baskets of late-blooming flowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the warm glow of oil lamps in the windows suggested life and warmth within. Sarah paused at the gate, suddenly uncertain. What if Jake had been wrong? What if Mrs. Patterson took one look at her and turned her away like everyone else had? What if this was just another door about to be slammed in her face? But the memory of Jake's eyes, steady and kind in the lamplight, gave her the courage to walk up the porch steps and knock on the front door. The woman who answered was perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned back in a neat bun and wearing a blue calico dress protected by a flour-dusted apron. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind, as she took in Sarah's appearance, lingering on the expensive coat that clearly didn't belong to her. "You must be Sarah, Mrs. Patterson said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only a matter-of-fact acceptance that somehow put Sarah at ease. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake Morrison said you might. That is, he thought you could use some help." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened at the mention of Jake's name. "Did he now? Well, that boy's got more sense than most folks give him credit for." She stepped back, holding the door open wide. "Come in, child. You look half frozen." The interior of the boarding house was everything the outside had promised: warm, clean, and welcoming. The front parlor was furnished with comfortable chairs and a stone fireplace where logs crackled cheerfully. The scent of baking bread filled the air, making Sarah's empty stomach clench with longing. "Sit yourself down by the fire," Mrs. Patterson instructed, bustling toward what Sarah assumed was the kitchen. "I'll fetch you some breakfast. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Sarah sank into one of the chairs, Jake's coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and stared into the dancing flames. She couldn't remember the last time someone had shown her such immediate, uncomplicated kindness. It felt almost too good to be true. Mrs. Patterson returned with a tray laden with scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, fresh biscuits with honey, and a steaming cup of coffee. Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the sight of so much food, more than she'd seen in one place since before Thomas died. "Now don't you go crying over breakfast," Mrs. Patterson said briskly, though her tone was gentle. "Eat up, and then we'll talk." Sarah ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Mrs. Patterson settled into the chair across from her with her own cup of coffee. The older woman didn't pepper her with questions or demand explanations, simply sat in comfortable silence while Sarah filled the hollow ache in her stomach. When she finally set down her fork, feeling more human than she had in weeks, Mrs. Patterson leaned forward slightly. "Jake tells me you're looking for work," she said, "and it so happens I'm looking for help. My last girl ran off to get married last month, left me trying to manage this place all by myself. I've got 6 rooms to keep clean, 3 meals a day to cook, and laundry that never seems to end." Sarah's heart leaped. "I can do all of that," she said quickly. "I'm a hard worker, Mrs. Patterson. I won't let you down." "I'm sure you won't." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment. "The pay isn't much, room and board, plus $2 a week, but it's honest work and you'd be safe here." $2 a week. It wasn't much, but it was more than Sarah had now, and the promise of a warm bed and regular meals felt like a fortune. "Thank you," she whispered, fresh tears threatening to spill over. "You don't know what this means to me." "I think I do." "Mrs. Patterson replied gently, "We've all needed help at one time or another. The lucky ones are those who find it when they need it most." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window, and Sarah's heart skipped when she recognized the rider. Jake Morrison sat tall in his saddle, his dark hair catching the morning sunlight, looking like something out of a storybook hero. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, then walked up the porch steps with that same easy confidence Sarah remembered from the night before. His knock was firm, but polite, and Mrs. Patterson rose to answer it with a smile. "Jake Morrison, you're right on time," she said, ushering him into the parlor. "Come meet your new friend properly." Jake removed his hat as he entered, revealing the full impact of those remarkable eyes in the daylight. They found Sarah immediately, and she saw relief there, and something that might have been pride. "Miss Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that same warm quality she remembered. "I'm glad to see you made it here safely." "Thanks to you," Sarah replied, standing up slowly. The coat, his coat, felt suddenly heavy on her shoulders. "I should return this to you." But Jake shook his head. "Keep it," he said simply. "Winter's coming, and you'll need it more than I will." "I can't," Sarah protested. "It's too valuable, and I can't pay you for it." Jake's expression grew serious, and he took a step closer. "Some things can't be bought or sold, Miss Sarah. Some things are given freely, with no expectation of payment. That coat is one of them." Mrs. Patterson watched this exchange with interest, her sharp eyes moving between them. "Well," she said finally, "I think this calls for celebration. Sarah's agreed to come work for me, and Jake, you're staying for lunch. I won't hear any arguments." Over the meal that followed, Sarah learned more about the man who had changed her life with a single act of kindness. Jake was a ranch hand who worked for the Double R spread about 10 miles south of town. He'd grown up in Texas, lost his parents young, and had been making his own way in the world since he was 15. He was quiet but thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable. Most importantly, he treated Sarah like a person worthy of respect. He asked her opinion on things, listened when she spoke, and never once made her feel like she needed to justify her existence or apologize for her circumstances. "What brought you to Millfield?" he asked over Mrs. Patterson's apple pie, his question free of the suspicion and judgment she'd grown accustomed to. Sarah hesitated, then decided that honesty was the least she owed him. "My husband died," she said simply. "Consumption. We had debts, and I lost everything. I came here hoping for a fresh start, but small towns can be hard on outsiders." Jake finished when she trailed off. "Especially those who don't fit the mold they expect." "Exactly." Sarah looked down at her hands, still pale and thin from weeks of poor eating. "I tried to find work, tried to explain, but no one would listen. They'd made up their minds about me before I even opened my mouth." Jake's jaw tightened slightly. "Their loss," he said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see you're a good person who's had some bad luck. That's not a crime, no matter what some folks might think." The simple validation nearly undid her. Sarah blinked back tears and managed a shaky smile. "Thank you for believing that." "Don't thank me for seeing what's right in front of me," Jake replied. "Thank yourself for not giving up when it would have been easier to." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. Mrs. Patterson was kind but practical, outlining her duties and showing her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. Jake stayed longer than he probably should have, helping to carry wood for the fireplace and fixing a loose step on the back porch without being asked. When he finally prepared to leave, Sarah walked him out to his horse. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and the air held the promise of another cold night. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said, as Jake swung into his saddle. "You've given me more than just a coat or a job recommendation. You've given me back my hope." Jake looked down at her, and in the fading light, his eyes seemed to glow with warmth. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. Just be happy. Build a good life here. That's all the thanks I need. He started to turn his horse toward the road, then paused. I'll be in town again next weekend, he said. Maybe I could take you to the church social, if you'd like to go, that is. Sarah's heart fluttered. Are you sure you want to be seen with me? People talk, and I wouldn't want to damage your reputation. Jake's smile was soft, but determined. Let them talk, he said. I've never much cared what small minds think, and I'm not about to start now. As he rode away into the gathering dusk, Sarah touched the coat that still enveloped her and marveled at how much her life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been alone, desperate, and convinced that the world had no place for her. Today, she had work, shelter, and something even more precious. The knowledge that there were still people in the world who chose kindness over judgment, who saw worth in others when everyone else saw only problems to be avoided. Most precious of all, she had Jake Morrison, a man who had looked past her circumstances to see the woman beneath, and who had shown her more love in a single, silent moment than she had ever thought possible. For the first time since Thomas died, Sarah allowed herself to believe that happiness might be possible after all. 3 months had passed since that cold October night, when Jake Morrison had changed Sarah's life with a coat and a look, and as Christmas approached, Millfield had transformed into something almost magical. Snow blanketed the town in pristine white. Icicles hung like crystal chandeliers from the eaves of buildings, and warm light spilled from every window, creating pools of gold on the snow-covered streets. Sarah stood at the window of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, watching the townspeople hurry past with packages and parcels, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp winter air. She hardly recognized the woman reflected in the glass. Healthy color had returned to her cheeks, her hair shone with cleanliness and care, and her eyes held a light that had been absent for far too long. The blue wool dress she wore was simple but well made, a gift from Mrs. Patterson, who had declared that anyone working in her establishment needed to look respectable. But more than the dress or the improved circumstances, it was the confidence in her bearing that marked the greatest change. Sarah Mitchell was no longer a woman running from her past. She was a woman building her future. Sarah, dear, could you help me with these pies? Mrs. Patterson called from the kitchen, her voice warm with the affection that had grown between them over the months of working side by side. Of course, Sarah replied, turning away from the window with a smile. She had grown to love the older woman, like the mother she'd lost years ago, and Mrs. Patterson seemed to return the feeling. The boarding house had become more than just a place of employment. It had become home. The kitchen was filled with the scents of cinnamon and nutmeg, of roasting turkey and fresh-baked bread. Mrs. Patterson was preparing for the Christmas Eve dinner she hosted every year for anyone who might otherwise spend the holiday alone, traveling salesmen, new arrivals to town, and anyone else who needed a place at the table. Jake will be here soon, Mrs. Patterson said with a knowing smile, as Sarah began transferring golden brown pies to the cooling racks. He's been coming by more and more frequently, you know. I don't think it's just for my cooking. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at the mention of Jake's name. Over the past 3 months, he had become a constant presence in her life, visiting every weekend, and sometimes during the week when his work brought him to town. They had attended the church social he'd promised, weathering the stares and whispers with dignity, and gradually, inevitably, something deeper than gratitude had grown between them. Jake Morrison was unlike any man she had ever known. He was patient where Thomas had been impulsive, steady where her late husband had been mercurial. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and never made her feel like she needed to be anything other than exactly who she was. With him, she felt not just protected, but truly seen and appreciated. Mrs. Patterson, Sarah said carefully, not looking up from her work, do you think, that is it wrong of me to have feelings for someone so soon after losing Thomas? The older woman paused in her preparation of the stuffing and looked at Sarah with gentle understanding. Child, Grief isn't a thing that follows a schedule. You mourned your husband properly, honored his memory, and learned to carry on without him. That doesn't mean you have to spend the rest of your life alone to prove your love for him. But people might think, people will always think something, Mrs. Patterson interrupted firmly. The question is whether you're going to live your life for them or for yourself. From what I've seen, Jake Morrison is a good man who cares for you deeply. If you care for him too, then that's something to be grateful for, not ashamed of. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see Jake dismounting from his horse. And as always, the sight of him made Sarah's heart skip. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, tall and lean in his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed beneath his hat. But there was something different about him today, a tension in his movements that Sarah had never seen before. He seemed nervous, almost uncertain, as he tied his horse to the hitching post and walked toward the house. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said with a mysterious smile, "I think I'll go check on the dining room preparations. You can let Jake in, dear." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer the door, her pulse quickening with each step. When she opened it, Jake stood on the threshold, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Merry Christmas, Jake," she replied, stepping back to let him in. "You're early. Dinner won't be ready for another hour." "Actually," Jake said, glancing around the empty parlor, "I was hoping I could speak with you alone first, if that's all right." Something in his tone made Sarah's breath catch. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and led him to the sitting area by the fireplace. Jake remained standing, his hat clutched in his hands, his blue-gray eyes intense in the flickering light. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of nervousness she'd never seen from him before. "I've been thinking about that night when we first met, about what happened, what it meant." Sarah's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Jake, let me finish," he said gently. "Please, I've been practicing this speech for weeks, and if I don't get it out now, I never will." He took a deep breath and looked directly into her eyes. "3 months ago, I saw a woman who was broken, alone, and convinced that the world had no place for her. But I also saw something else. I saw strength that refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. I saw dignity that couldn't be crushed by cruelty or circumstances. I saw a heart that was still capable of trust, even after being betrayed by life itself." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, afraid to break the spell of his words. "What I'm trying to say," Jake continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is that I didn't just give you my coat that night. You gave me something too. You gave me purpose, hope, a reason to believe that there was still goodness in the world worth protecting. You gave me love, Sarah, even though neither of us knew it at the time." He dropped to one knee then, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, and Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she realized what was happening. "I know it hasn't been long," Jake said, his voice now steady and sure. "I know people will talk, say it's too soon, that we haven't known each other long enough. But I also know that some connections go deeper than time, that some people come into your life exactly when you need them most." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the firelight and threw it back in tiny rainbows. "Sarah Mitchell," Jake said, his eyes never leaving hers, "you are the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You have shown me what it means to face adversity with grace, to find hope in the darkest places, to trust in the goodness of others, even when that trust has been broken before. I love you, not despite your past, but because of everything it has made you. Will you marry me?" The tears Sarah had been holding back spilled over, hot tracks down her cheeks that felt like joy given physical form. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands reaching out to frame his beloved face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Jake Morrison, I will marry you. The smile that spread across Jake's features was like sunrise after the longest night. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. I love you too, she whispered against his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sage that had become synonymous with safety and home. I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. Don't be frightened, Jake murmured, pulling back to look at her. We've both had enough fear to last a lifetime. From now on, it's just us, building something good together. The sound of applause from the kitchen doorway made them both turn, and they found Mrs. Patterson standing there with tears in her eyes and a smile that could have lit up the entire town. Well, it's about time, she said, bustling forward to embrace them both. I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. You knew? Sarah asked, laughing through her tears. Child, I've been married 40 years. I know what love looks like when I see it. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with her apron. And I can't think of two people who deserve happiness more than you do. As the afternoon wore on, the boarding house filled with guests for the Christmas Eve dinner. Word of the engagement spread quickly, and Sarah was touched by the warm congratulations she received, even from some of the townspeople who had shunned her months before. It seemed that Jake's acceptance of her had given others permission to see her worth as well. But it was the quiet moments with Jake that she treasured most, the way he stayed close to her side throughout the evening, the proud smile he wore when he introduced her as his fiancée, the gentle squeeze of his hand when he sensed she was becoming overwhelmed by the attention. Later, as the evening wound down and the last guests prepared to leave, Jake pulled Sarah aside once more. I have something else for you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket again. This time, he pulled out a familiar object that made Sarah's heart skip. It was a small leather-bound journal, worn soft with age and handling. It was my mother's, Jake explained softly. She used to write in it every day, thoughts, dreams, memories she wanted to preserve. When she died, my father gave it to me, said that someday I should give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Sarah accepted the journal with reverent hands, running her fingers over the soft leather cover. Jake, I can't take this. It's too precious. It's exactly as precious as it should be, he replied, covering her hands with his. I want you to have it, Sarah. I want you to fill it with our story, our dreams, our life together. I want you to write about the woman who rose from the ashes of her old life to build something beautiful and new. Sarah opened the journal to the first blank page and saw that Jake had already written something there in his careful, precise handwriting. For Sarah, who showed me that the greatest love stories begin not with perfect people, but with broken hearts, learning to trust again. December 24th, 1887, the first day of forever. The tears came again, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of hope for all the pages yet to be filled. Sarah looked up at the man who had saved her life with a simple act of kindness and seen in her not what she had lost, but what she could become. I love you, Jake Morrison, she said, her voice strong and clear, and I promise you, our story will be worth writing. Outside, snow continued to fall on the small frontier town of Millfield, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside the warm boarding house, two people who had found each other in their darkest hour held each other close and looked toward a future bright with possibility. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and passionate declarations. Others begin with a coat, a look, and the simple recognition that everyone deserves kindness, especially when the world has been cruel. Sarah and Jake's story began with both, and it would continue for many years to come, written in the pages of a worn leather journal, and lived out in the daily choices they made to see the best in each other and in the world around them. For in the end, that was what love truly was. Not just the dramatic moments of rescue and proposal, but the quiet, steady decision to keep choosing each other day after day through whatever storms might come. And as Christmas morning dawned bright and clear over the snow-covered plains of the American frontier, Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Sarah Morrison, knew that she had found not just love, but home. Not just rescue, but the strength to rescue herself. Not just a coat to keep out the cold, but arms that would hold her warm for the rest of her life. The story of the cloak and the look had become the story of two hearts learning to trust again, and that story was just beginning.